All right, so hey everybody, we are taking a deeper look at the development of American culture. There's definitely some pictures and maybe some skippable moments in here, but this is already looking a little bit on the long side, so let's get straight to it. All right, so in class we talked about the overview and the European influences and the American elements and how you're taking some European ideas and kind of blending it in with the early phases of what I would call American exceptionalism and the idea that the United States is going to be a city upon a hill. And then we have talked about the development of transcendentalism. You may have already heard some of that stuff going on over in English class as well, right? So this is where you start to see a little bit of that individualism, that truth to your own self being brought in as a way to achieve human perfectibility. But I think we need to kind of branch out a little bit and see how this is going to relate into other elements of 19th century American literature and American art. In terms of literature, it might seem like a weird place to start, but Webster's Dictionary, it's first published in 1828, and the big deal with this is I guess there's two big deals with this. One of which is that it is going to establish American English spelling, and it's going to include technical terms for arts and sciences. On the technical terms, that's going to be important for defining things that are going to be used so far as I guess textile mill technology and sciences as they're starting to develop to help with the growth of the economy. So the spelling and the terminology gets to be a little bit more standardized. So this is where it's going to take some time for this to sink in, but I think everybody still is kind of like familiar with Webster's Dictionary. I hope so anyway, right? The other thing that's a big deal with this is that this is an American English spelling. This is kind of taking the idea of the English language and trying to separate it from England. So while this is a very odd place to think about when it comes down to literature, because I guess technically Webster's Dictionary isn't literature, but it's kind of a necessary first step. So far as popular literature is concerned, we're talking about like what people would actually read. So this is going to see a huge growth of newspapers and magazines. Schools and education are getting to be a little bit more standardized, and as people are reading, they're reading more than just the Bible or just in things for their religious study. They're going to read about what's going on in the news because as educated voters or Republican mothers, there is a kind of a feeling to try to learn about the news. And so newspapers like the New York Herald, which is in the 1830s established as a penny press, cheap newspapers that it would literally just cost you a penny to buy your daily copy of it. And this is just going to be a way to get more people access to more information. And this is kind of a consistent trend as you go through this, and similar notions going on in England and other parts of Europe. But on an American sense, this is kind of like dovetailing with the ideas of democracy or the ideas of education and having a better educated workforce. Magazines like the North American Review, which starts in 1815, or Godey's Ladies Book, which starts in 1830. These are both literary magazines where there are, essays and poems and short stories published. The North American Review is a little bit more about, I guess, politics. John Adams, founding father John Adams, he's one of the earliest contributors to this. North American Review is still in publication today. Godey's Ladies Book is it's a literary magazine that kind of starts in the 1830s, a little bit more on the, I guess, literature side of this than like news and current events, because this was really kind of targeted as being something that was going to be for women, middle class women that were going to be in the cult of domesticity and Republican mothers, in trying to help relay some of the morality or point out some of the immorality that was going on in society. Godey's Ladies Book is going to be in publication until like the early 20th century, right around World War One. But there's like some heavy hitters in both of these. I mentioned John Adams in North American Review. For Godey's Ladies Book, there's some of the poets and authors that we're going to talk about. Edgar Allan Poe, Washington Irving, not Thoreau, Emerson gets a couple things published in here, and the original author for Mary Had a Little Lamb. She's one of the founders of Godey's Ladies book. So this is kind of like really a central piece of American literature as things are going to develop in the long run, kind of on a nationwide basis, maybe a little bit more of a northeastern focus, but these are like, these are trends that are seeing across the country. A little bit more localized is the literature, the regionalist literature of the Knickerbocker group. This is a literary circle, had their own literary magazines, kind of centered in New York. If, basketball fans, New York Knicks, that's the New York Knickerbockers. It kind of goes back to this term, which kind of goes back to, like Dutch cultures, back to the colonial days even. There's two central figures of the Knickerbocker group to keep track of. One of them is Washington Irving. His two big examples that I could like mention real briefly here of short stories that he has written. One is Rip Van Winkle, story of the guy that falls asleep for 20 years. In the actual context of the story, he falls asleep in the early phases of the American Revolution, and he wakes up during the presidency of George Washington, and there's like this huge culture shock that goes on about, what his expectations are and kind of what the reality is when he wakes up in the 1790s. Irving's pretty good about blending like some European literary traditions and kind of putting like an American spin on this, and kind of setting this around the founding of the country is kind of a direct nod in that direction. Irving's also like a historical writer, writing about like the founding fathers and trying to play up that sense of American nationalism. The following years, when Irving publishes The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. If this picture just popped up on the right side, we'll get to it in a minute. This is The Headless Horseman, Ichabod Crane, good Halloween story, but it's a ghost story that is kind of embedded into ideas of the American frontier. So this is, kind of a ongoing American literary celebrated form these days. It kind of gets resurrected on a regular basis. Um, Other big Knickerbocker figure to put into play on this is James Fenimore Cooper. His big, novel, his most famous novel is The Last of the Mohicans, which is centered around Native American tribes, the Mohicans, right around the time of the French and Indian War. And again, kind of like a nod back to that founding father period. And, well, trying to celebrate it in some way. Not a whole lot of sense of reality in these things, because whether it is in The Last of the Mohicans or Rip Van Winkle or Sleepy Hollow, these aren't necessarily realistic stories, but they're like romanticized some. That's supposed to be more about like an emotional output, like the glory for heroes of days past and that kind of thing. And that is definitely something that's going to be echoed even more so in other versions of American Romanticism. So in terms of American Romantic literature, for folks that were in Euro, and even if you weren't in Euro, there's a connection to this to just European Romanticism, which is literary form at the same point in time. In both cases, there is a real focus on emotion and feelings and your individualist ideas. I feel strongly that transcendentalism and that idea of march to the beat of your own drummer, I feel strongly that that is actually an example of American Romanticism. It's just College Board tends to separate that out a little bit. That's open for some interpretation. All of this is kind of like, and I think even like Irving and Cooper, or like with the Knickerbocker group, this is still like some emotional outpouring for like love of strong heroes in stories. It's not always a positive emotional feeling that comes out of this, because when we talk about like short story doing in prose, not too much on the novel, a couple of novels show up in here, but Edgar Allan Poe is kind of like the creator of the modern short story right here in the 1830s and 40s. And Poe's, while he has definitely got his writing both in short stories and in poems, it's definitely got an emotional appeal into it. It's kind of like more on the creepy side of things, right? Where he's kind of like tapping into the darker elements of the human, of human emotion and human psyche, but it still kind of fits him into like a romantic belief. Same can be said for like Nathaniel Hawthorne, who his big novel in 1850 is called The Scarlet Letter, story of a Puritan family, so a callback to American history, a Puritan community that is kind of abiding by their morals. And so when a woman has been accused of adultery, she is sentenced to wear a scarlet A at all times when she goes like outside of her house. And so it's a little bit of a critique of conformity and individualism, a little bit of critique about some of the standards of society, but still has an American sort of context to it. Probably one of the greatest novels out of the 19th century, although it's more celebrated after the author died. This is Moby Dick, the story of the American whalers and Captain Ahab, who is searching for the great white whale that has ruined his life in many ways. And Melville is again tapping into those negative emotions that people have, like obsession and the lust for control and the lust for power. And like all three of these guys, Melville, Poe, and Hawthorne, they still fit into romanticism because it's about emotion, but it's not always positive. Transcendentalism is more of a positive version of romanticism, and sometimes you will see these guys, Poe, Hawthorne, and Melville, they'll be referred to as anti-transcendentalists, just as a way that they're still kind of focusing on emotion and individuality, but maybe that individuality is going to have negative consequences for you in the long run. On the poetry side, and look, it's me as the ex-English teacher is the reason I'm an ex-English teacher. I'm not going to get too much the into the poems on this, but just name dropping. Longfellow and Walt Whitman and John Greenleaf Whittier, that is them left to right on the screen. They are seen as being like the great American poets of this era. And this is really like a centerpiece of this type of Celebrate America, whether it is celebrate American ideals or American life on the frontier or celebrating nature, which is a big part of American viewpoints. But this is definitely something that's not only seen in literature, but is also seen in the art and architecture of the period. Okay, so when we talk about other styles of culture, like we're in here, we're going to talk about architecture, building styles. There are going to be, just like on the literature and on the philosophy and even on the religion, there's going to be a blending of European styles and some purely American ideas. So in the United States, they refer to something as federal architecture, and that means it's got like a Renaissance influence, Greek revival, columns and symmetry, and that kind of thing. And that's also going to come back in Europe at around the same point in time. That's called neoclassical art. In England, they called it Georgian art because it's centered around King George, whichever George you're talking about is just kind of at the same time. So symmetry and proportion. And then if you want to talk about like a uniquely American style of architecture, that is the log cabin, which is kind of like this archetypal archetype of American structure that kind of makes it unique from the rest of the world. So let's take a few examples. Let's take a look at a few examples of this. Okay, and I'll be honest with you on some of these. I don't know that I'm going to feel a real need to talk about these pictures in a whole lot of detail, but what we see on this slide are three examples of federal architecture. Over here on, well, two examples of federal architecture, but more on that in just a second. So up here in the top left, this is Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It's one of the original state house buildings for the state of Pennsylvania, and you can kind of see it's symmetrical. It kind of has like an even proportion to it. It just looks very like pleasing to the eye so far as that symmetry is concerned. Over here on the top right, this is the rotunda at the University of Virginia. The architect on this is Thomas Jefferson. The Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. is really kind of based on this structure. So is, to a certain point, so is Jefferson's home at Monticello in Virginia. That structure is kind of like a modern copy of the Roman Pantheon. So in the bottom right, that's the Pantheon, which is built over, I mean, almost 2,000 years prior to the Rotunda at the University of Virginia, but it is designed to be a callback to that. So this is a Greek Roman revival on this, where it's focused on symmetry and proportion. You can see similar elements of this showing up within the nation's capital. So top right, I hope you recognize that is the White House. Our Ultimate President's Guide video has done a pretty good job of showing how it's developed over time. But those columns, that is a callback to Greek and Roman days. It is symmetrical. So is the Capitol building. This is an 1846. A daguerreotype is just a photo of the U.S. Capitol before the transition to the current dome they've got, like in what 2022. That dome is going to be built and replaced during the Civil War, so we'll see some pictures of that in a few weeks. But this again is like the dome and the columns and the symmetry. It's federal work. And then for that unique quintessential American architecture, it's the log cabin. It's everything from the fact that Abe Lincoln was born in one to, oh my gosh, log cabin maple syrup, which is really kind of playing on like a dose of Americana, kind of like Quaker Oats for that matter. But you know, their top left is a replica log cabin. It's hard to find good pictures of like real like 18th century log cabins because there's not that many of them that are still standing. But here on the bottom right, this is actually a presidential campaign poster from 1840. William Henry Harrison as the Whig candidate. Log cabin and hard cider was his big campaign slogan, and he was trying to portray the idea that he was an average American born in a log cabin. So there's like that element of symbolism that comes along with it. That symbolism is like this connection to nature, the connection to the frontier, the connection to things that make the log cabin and the United States in general, for that matter, completely distinct from the European predecessors. In terms of art, and here where I'm going to focus, exclusively on painting. Here in art, we're talking still about the same kind of two big ideas: a celebration of the American nation, so that American slant being put on everything, so far as the subject matter is concerned. We'll see examples from Gilbert Stuart and John Trumbull here in just a minute. And then there is the romantic beliefs that are going, like emotion and the back to nature and the natural landscape. And in the 19th century, I didn't put any artist names on this slide, but we'll see a couple here in just a moment. But this is what they would refer to as the Hudson River School. The Hudson River, which is connecting New York City to Albany. It's going to be the link that's going to come into the Erie Canal, that upstate New York location. It's kind of a central piece for not just for art, but if you remember the burned over district and for the Second Great Awakening, there's just lots of activity going on as far as developing a national culture. It's like there's the Knickerbocker group. It's like New York's really kind of strong and influential on this, which is maybe saying something about the influence of its role in the market revolution. So we'll take a look at a few examples of this. Can't guarantee I'm going to talk through every example that's on here, but there's definitely a few pieces to take a look at. Two quick examples here. The Athenaeum portrait of George Washington. This is, it's the dollar bill. It is like the portrait that Gilbert Stuart does. George Washington sat for this portrait, and it becomes like the basic role model for any other portrait of George Washington done in the last couple of years of his life and for any point in time afterwards. The larger painting on the right, this is from the Battle of Princeton. This is a romanticized view of what's going on there, as you have the evil redcoats that are coming in and getting ready to kill more Americans, and it's kind of like that call for like the emotional appeal. But look, there's George Washington and the American flag exactly in the center of things. So it is a definite push towards that American patriotic belief, painted in 1831. Painted in 1851 is Washington crossing the Delaware. I can let y'all pause in on this and kind of like take a look at some of the details if you want to, but this is definitely an example of a romanticized version of a founding father leading this nation towards independence. For the Hudson River School, and I didn't put like Hudson River School on this, but Thomas Cole is one of the great Hudson River School painters. This is an imaginary scene from James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans, so it's a nice carryover to some of the literature. But I know you can tell the people that are there, but front and center on this is the landscape, the beauty and the grandeur of the American landscape in that back to nature moment. Another Thomas Cole painting with Home in the Woods. It's a log cabin, no less. And so this is really where you kind of see like Americans and the role that they're going to play in this back to nature movement. And then here, another one from Thomas Cole is like huge on architecture. What you've got is like the Oxbow. This is the Connecticut River near Northampton. This is just like a really tight bend in the river as it goes through. Also, imagery on this is notable that you see the storm clouds on the left side and the clearing skies on the right side. The idea that the storm is passing and that there are good times ahead for God's chosen country. Literally, God's chosen country being shown here. It is worth pointing out that on these Thomas Cole landscapes, they are not necessarily tied to a specific point on the map. They are like the majority of these Hudson River School landscapes are kind of imaginary so far as their actual setting is concerned, and that's okay. Romanticism means you don't have to pay close attention to details because it's more about like the awe-inspiring emotional experience of seeing God's chosen country. While this is still considered part of the Hudson River School, definitely people more of a central role on this. So you've got Daniel Boone and Settlers in the Cumberland Gap. Daniel Boone as one, not as a founding father, but as a frontier settler, frontier woodsman. And over on the right side, there's Raftsmen, the Raftsmen playing cards. I like this painting because it is important for me to remember to tell you that there's nothing special about these guys. They are just common people at a point in time where you are experiencing democracy for the common man in the 1840s and 1850s. And so normal Americans, not just founding fathers, are going to start to work their way into like some of these great pieces of art because, well, primarily because it's like they're just Americans. And then finally, on this run of pictures, the Storm King on the Hudson River, and the Storm King is like the steam boat that is here on the right side. This nice blending of the natural landscape and the man-made intervention as it all is coming into being. And the last little bit for me here, whether you're talking about like the specific examples within art and architecture, or probably more importantly, looking at the overview of all of this, there is a blending of American elements, American history already coming into play as that you're seeing a American spin put on these European artistic, philosophical, literary styles. So as this is kind of gone throughout this time period, you get a much more uniquely American experience, which is going to will continue to hold true, obviously, and it's going to get better and better defined as you move into, and especially after, the Civil War.